Yeah, thanks for the organization, and thank you all for coming here on this sunny day. So these two movies that you showed, they are two examples of the beautiful smart materials that you can make using polysteric liquid crystals. In our group, we have been working with different flavors of these materials for more than a decade. And tonight I would like to show you some of the cool things you can do with them. But as you might guess from the subtitle, I don't only want to talk about what we do in our group, but I also want to talk about the relationship between academic research and society and industry and politics. And I hope to show you that there is actually great possibility for a relationship that can be very beneficial for all actors involved. But an important thing for that to happen is that we have a shared understanding of how applied research works and how maybe I would say how the most important technological breakthroughs have been made, and that very often fundamental science plays a very important role in that. There is a not so uncommon idea that science or research can be divided between basic science, where academics do research for the ivory tower, and applied science, where heroes like Elon Musk makes all the cool stuff that the world ends up using. But that's not quite the case. And applied research, not only is there this idea, but applied research also often has a better reputation in some regions. And when I was in Korea, I definitely experienced that this could be the case. So quite often I noticed that when I had given a talk about our research, the first question that I got was this one. And the way the question is formulated suggests that research should be motivated by an application. And that is really not necessarily true. And I think it's important that we also have fundamental research that is done for other reasons. And when I came back to Luxembourg in 2014, or when I came to Luxembourg in 2014, I thought, okay, Europe is after all different, and we'll probably experience a quite different attitude here. But the first talk I gave here, the first question I got was this one. So very much the same type of attitude. Well, by now I'm actually very happy to say that I can confidently say that yes, what we do is very useful, because I can relate to or refer to some of the many ongoing research activities that we have on applied use cases of these two movies, basically, together with lots of collaborators. But I really want to emphasize that this was not the primary driving force. It was always curiosity. We were just blown away by these beautiful colors and textures that we were seeing in the microscope, and we wanted to understand where did they come from. What was the origin of this? We felt like Sherlock Holmes, who could not resist to go into the mysteries and try to figure out what was the origin. And this curiosity and desire to understand deep is always part of the process, even when we do work in an applied way, try to solve a concrete problem. In fact, coming back to the Korean question, my premise for tonight's talk is that there must exist research where there is no application in mind. Let me explain why by giving a few examples that I think are quite important. This here is Daniel Forlenda. He was the first liquid crystal synthetic chemist. He invented more than 1,000 molecules, and he was the one who formulated the first design rules for liquid crystals. You might think that if you consider today, you know the enormous success of the liquid crystal displays, or LCDs, and you might think that he would have realized that what he discovered had great potential, but when he was asked, he didn't see any potential at all. Was he short-sighted? Was he stupid? Well, Heinrich Hertz wasn't so much more foresighted either. He had discovered or proven Maxwell to be right by proving the existence of radio waves. And he just said, it's of no use whatsoever. This isn't just an experiment that proves Maestro Maxwell right. We just have these mysterious electromagnetic waves that we cannot see with the naked eye, but they're there. And when he was asked, are they useful in some way? No, nothing, I guess. I don't know if anyone asked Max Planck about the applications of quantum mechanics, but I imagine that he would have answered in a similar way. Looking back today, we can see that the three discoveries that these gentlemen, these scientists made, actually made the modern smartphone possible. The semiconductors that run the machine, they are applications of quantum mechanics. Liquid crystals enable the first portable displays. And of course, the whole point of a smartphone is wireless communication. But the first working transistor appeared in 1947. The first televisions hit the markets in 1930s. And when Heinrich Hertz proved the radio waves, the wired telephone was the novelty of the day. So these discoveries were simply so much ahead of their time of application that you couldn't even have imagined the concepts at the time. And that's important to remember when you ask people, what are the applications of your research? Now, a more recent and concrete example is this one. We probably all want to forget this time, right? But maybe there was one thing that we all learned, or many things that we all learned, and one abbreviation that maybe you remember, PCR. We all did these PCR tests, right? Anyone knows what PCR stands for?
Polymerase chain reaction.
Exactly. So we all did PCR tests. Most of us don't know what it is. But it's actually an amazing technology. If you think about how important it was, it really is amazing. So what is polymerase chain reaction? Well, it started back in the 70s, and this biotech startup, Cetus, they were trying to come up with a DNA-based test for sickle cell anemia. The idea was that you would just test the DNA and be able to see if a mutation was there, to see if you have sickle cell anemia or not. The problem was that reading DNA was really difficult. One person said it was the equivalent of reading a car license plate in the dark from the moon. The person who gave that description was also the person who solved the problem. That was Kary Mullis, Nobel Prize in 1993. His stroke of genius was to realize that reading one plate is difficult, but it might be much more easy to read billions of plates. His idea was to replicate the DNA over and over and over again, so you're not looking for one snippet of mutation, you have billions of copies floating around. This was PCR. Let me show you how it works. You start by heating up the DNA to 95 degrees roughly, because at that temperature, the double-stranded DNA, that is our genetic code, separates into two single strands. That's important because now you can add a bunch of, or a soup, let's say, of monomers, nucleotide monomers, and small snippets called primers. These primers are designed to match a small part of the single-stranded DNA ahead of the mutation. And then comes the P, the polymerase. You now lower the temperature again, so you get double-stranded DNA between the primer and the single strand, so it's an incomplete primer. And then you let the polymerize the remaining chain. So you get a second copy. And then you do this all over again. You heat again to 95 degrees Celsius. Both double-stranded DNA is now separate. you run the polymerase, you lower the temperature, you run the polymerase, and you have 4 copies, and you do this over and over again. The problem with this are all those high temperature steps. Because when Kerry Mullis came up with this idea, and when the team demonstrated it, they were using polymerase from E. coli. And E. coli, well, it's a normal bacterium, and heating E. coli or its polymerase up to 95 degrees Celsius, it just destroys the polymerase. So they had a process that worked, but it was very slow, inefficient, expensive, because they had to add new polymerase all the time. But the solution to the problem had actually been found 20 years earlier. In Yellowstone National Park, in these fantastic hot acid springs that, for instance, this Emerald Pool and these places. Nobody thought there could be life in these environments because the water was boiling and was very acidic and so on. So when Thomas Brock, the biologist, came there to look for life, everyone considered him a wacko. But he was convinced that those colors were from bacterial descendants. Turned out he was right. So his PhD, or his master student at the time, Hudson Freeze, pretty good name if you're going to study hot springs, right? They went there and looked at sample after sample, and eventually they found this. This is Thymus aquaticus, or TAC. These were the first extremophiles, the first time we found life that thrives in extreme conditions. Hudson Freeze is still alive, so here is him commenting on what they discovered.
It meant that if an organism was going to live up there, it had to have all of its essential enzymes adapted, living at that temperature. So it was clear boiling water is not going to knock these guys off. But we thought it had no application.
No application. That's how often scientists consider their research. But it did. Kerry Mullis, looking for the solution to this problem, realized that the polymerase of TAC would survive the 95 degrees of the cycle with charm. And it did. And until today, and throughout the whole pandemic, those little guys from Yellowstone National Park, they toured the world and saved the world. Because it's still TAC polymerase that is used in PCR. Another example is the Chemistry Nobel Prize in 2008 for GFP, or green fluorescent protein. You might think that a chemistry prize should be given to chemists, right? But actually, only Rajit Sen was a chemist. Osamu Shimomura made the fundamental discovery. He was a marine biologist. He was just curious about these fantastic jellyfish that glow. How does bioluminescence work? And he discovered that it's because of a protein that they have that make them fluoresce. And then he published that in the 1960s, and life went on, and nothing much happened. Until 30 years later, Martin Chalfie realized, maybe we could express this protein inside a nematode, or in other living species. And that was the beginning of GFP labeling of living species, which is absolutely essential today for both research in life sciences and medicine. Could a Tomahawk missile have anything to do with food? Can anyone think of the connection? So the brand at the back, Raytheon, that company actually started out making magnetrons during the Second World War. Magnetrons were microwave emitters that were very important in radar technology. That's why they were important in the Second World War. And one day, when they were testing a magnetron, a bunch of engineers were standing around it, and this guy, Percy Spencer, he had a peanut bar in his pocket. And he noticed that, this peanut bar melted. And he was curious enough that he didn't just throw the peanut bar away. He wanted to know what the heck happened. And he realized that the microwaves were exciting the water molecules in the food. And then he started exploring eggs and all kinds of things. And the military contract Raytheon ended up being the first producer of the microwave oven. The laser was the famous solution looking for its problem. It was invented in the 1950s, but it wasn't until 1974 that someone came up with the idea to use it in a supermarket barcode scanner. Then they were used in discs for storing information, CDs for those of us our generation who remember them, and then laser printers, laser pointers, and all kinds of things. The Teflon pan, discovered in 1938 by accident, and it took until 1954 before a chemical engineer finally discussed what can we do with this completely crazy, useless material with the cook. The cook happened to be his wife. And then they realized that this is actually useful, and that was the start of the Teflon. What can we learn from these stories? Well, the key lesson is that truly revolutionary breakthroughs, they are often enabled by discoveries that were made long before as a result of purely curiosity-driven research that wasn't even remotely connected to the field of breakthrough. Another thing we can note is that it can take a long time between the basic discovery and the application. And of course, one might want to minimize these delays to reap to really harvest the fruits, right? And is there some way that we can stimulate innovation and speed up the process? I think there is. And I think that method is interdisciplinary collaboration and conversation. And that's why I'm very happy to be part of the Institute of Advanced Studies here at the University of Luxembourg, which focus very strongly on interdisciplinarity and really pushes people from different disciplines to work together and explore different problems together. My contribution is usually to bring in liquid crystals. So what are liquid crystals? As the name suggests, they are between the solid crystal, long-range ordered, and the liquid that flows, and usually is isotropic. The liquid crystal really is both. It flows like a liquid. You can see here I'm just touching the cover slip with a spatula, and it flows like a liquid. But you see these colors, and you see such colors between a polarizing microscope, as is the case here, then you have long-range order. And that's the key thing of a liquid crystal. The liquid crystal we work with the most, and the only one I will be focusing on here, is called a nematic liquid crystal, which has just long-range orientation order. So molecules that are often rod-shaped they're often rod-shaped. They organize with the same direction of this rod on the average. In this direction we call the director. It also is the optic axis, which is important for the optical properties. And if you add a chiral dopant, chirality is the absence of mirror symmetry, then this director, it starts rotating along a helix. And this is important because now you're modulating the optical properties periodically, because remember the director is the optic axis. And this is basically the fundamental reason for what we do with cholesteric crystals. If you look at the optics of cholesteric liquid crystals, you see that you have a periodic structure, which we have in basic Bragg scattering as well, just like in classic X-ray scattering. But in this case, the period is on the order of light wavelengths. That's why it's more interesting with light in this case. So you have a reflection wavelength. If you send in light here somewhere, then you get light reflected. And the wavelength is a function of a product of the average refractive index times the pitch of the helix times cosine for the angle of incidence. So if we let the angle instead of instance be 0, we send in light along the helix and get red for reflection back, then we get the longest wavelength because cosine 0 is 1. Let's say that this wavelength is 650 nanometer, which is pretty much the longest that we can see, which means that this is going to be in the red, deep in the red. Any other angle will give us short blue shifted wavelengths. So, reflection. So if we send in white light along different directions, and we usually send in unpolarized light, then depending on the exact direction, we get a different color. The larger the angle, the more blue shifted the color. But what is really important is the chirality here. That is what makes this system so unique. Let's say that this helix is left-handed. It has to have a handedness. Then the reflection will also have a handedness. Cholesteric liquid crystals reflect only circularly polarized light with the same handedness as the helix. So if we have a left-handed helix, we get left-handed circularly polarized light. We'll see that this is super important. And one of the reasons is that circular polarization is very unusual in our work. Linear polarization happens quite a lot. We have Brewster triangle reflections, we have radio scattering from when the sun is low in the evening, for instance. But circular polarization is really unusual. Basically, the only creature I know that produces circular polarization is this little guy. And my postdoc, Akemaga there, was lucky enough to find one walking around in his vegetable garden. And as he is a liquid crystal scientist, he immediately took out his circular polarizer and filmed this beauty when it was crawling around. So this is through the left-handed circular polarizer. And then he's going to switch to right-handed, and you see the color is gone. Switching back to left-handed, the color is back. But you notice the background doesn't change. The background remains exactly the same. And that's the important thing. So if you have something circularly polarized, you can actually you can find exactly that in a very, very smart way. And that's something we've been working on for quite a while. But we started, again, very fundamental, very curiosity-driven. Back when I was in Korea, and my master student, Jonghyun, she had made the first monodispersed droplets made of this cholesteric liquid crystal. And we were just curious, what are we going to see from these when we curve color? Because most liquid crystal research was always done on flat films. So now we had droplets, and we were curious, what's going to happen? So what we were expecting was this. You have a sphere, you send in light from above, this is reflection microscopy. So from the middle we would get the longest wavelength, the red reflection. And that's what we see. The camera is a bit overexposed, that's why it doesn't look red but yellow, but that's actually the red reflection. And otherwise we wouldn't see much because of course the light is reflected away from us, right? That's what we expected. But this wasn't the only droplet in the sample. It was surrounded by lots of other droplets. And what we didn't expect was that all those other droplets that were not illuminated here, they were also sending light back to us. So how did this happen? And even more curious, when Jonghyun opened the aperture and illuminated more and more, we were seeing all these crazy spots appearing everywhere. Incredible patterns, different colors, different patterns and so on. And we were really wondering what is going on here. We understood that it must be related to some kind of communication between the droplets because we saw the same symmetry in the patterns as the packing of the droplets. And when Irene Dremeschek-Olenik came to visit us, then we had the opportunity to figure out what's going on. So the central droplet here is the one that is being illuminated first. So you illuminate from the top, you get the retroreflection back with the longest wavelength. But as we increase the illumination radius and the next droplet gets illuminated, that droplet can be irradiated a little bit at an angle, right? And if that angle is 45 degrees, it actually sends the light back to the first one, and then that one reflects it back out to us. But this is Bragg reflection, so this is now 45 degrees, which means we get the blue shifted color. And then everything is inside water, so we can have total internal reflection at the water-air interface, and we can have lots of these communication paths being possible thanks to also the total internal reflection. And that's what is the origin of these patterns. In addition, because it was a cholesteric, all these spots were always circularly polarized. And this last part was what got my friend and collaborator Matthew Schwartz really excited. So Matthew is an artist and architect with a strong interest in robotics. And he happened to be visiting or working in my colleagues group that is working with robotics at Seoul National University. And we ran into each other on a hike. In Korea, we do a lot of hiking. And we immediately became super good friends. And we started talking about everything. And when he heard about our cholesteric droplets and their polarization, he thought, oh, this can be interesting for motion capture. So this is Matt standing in the motion capture lab at SNU. Motion capture, in case you don't know about it, it's about, to do motion capture, you put a certain dress on a person, for instance, and this dress carries a lot of these spherical reflectors that are retroreflectors. And they send back, you send out light from the camera, infrared light, and the light is reflected back to the camera, and then the computer can figure out exactly the full motion of the person. Standard motion capture markers work like this. They look like this in normal light, and then you turn on the flash, and you really see very strong reflection back. Matthews thought, okay, if you have these polarized markers, and you can tune it's a selective reflection, you can tune the wavelengths, we can make motion capture markers that are invisible. And you can have different persons with different colors and so on, and you can really distinguish a lot of different things. And even more, he thought, well, maybe you can use your small spheres to put these things in patterns that are called fiducial markers. These black and white markers that you see here in the videos from Boston Dynamics, they are very powerful guidelines for robots to understand the world that they're interacting with. Each marker tells what is in this box, and by analyzing the size and the skew, the robot can figure out how far away is it and what is the orientation. So, very exciting, but we had liquid droplets in water. We were very far from being able to do anything like that. And then I came to Luxembourg, and I had the fortune to quickly get in contact with Gabriele Lenzini at SNT, who is a researcher expert in cybersecurity and secure authentication. Because we had this idea already in Korea that maybe these patterns could be used as a kind of fingerprint. And when I told Gabriele about these systems, the thing that he got the most excited about was that if you take an array of these spheres, and this is what they look like from above, now you change the illumination direction, you just illuminate from the side instead, then the exact same system looks like this. So it's not one pattern that you get from a certain array, it's an infinite number of dynamic patterns that depends on how you illuminate them. And Gabriele told me that this means that you have an infinite number of challenge response function, which turns these systems into what is called physical unclonable functions, or PUFs. I didn't know what that was at the time, but I understand now that this is a very powerful concept in the field of authentication. So also Gabriele got very excited, and we now realize that we really have to move from squishy droplets in water to something that we can work with. So we started taking on the challenge to move to particles, but in the meantime, we also made shells rather than droplets. So this is a slowed down movie of how we make these shells. We inject water inside the liquid crystal, and everything is captured in another water phase. And this was my postdoc, Jon, who came around 2015, and we really perfected this method for making our CSR shells. The fact that we have shells is interesting. So a shell is basically considered an orange peel, and the liquid crystal is the orange peel, the orange is the water inside. But the inside droplets has a different density than the liquid crystal. So almost always there will be a density mismatch, which means that the shell will be thinner at the top most of the time. And this is important because what I showed you so far, that was for a droplet or for a shell looked at from the thick side, because then you get all these reflections on the outside and so on. But if you flip it upside down, it is now so thin that what you see is this, a completely different pattern. And that's because now the light can go through and it gets reflected inside instead. And you have lots of these constructive interference sequences that give rise to these colored rings because we're doing light reflection. And as I said, we also went to polymerize the shells. And so Jon was the one who started with this, but then we had the fortune to also finally get a competent chemist, Lydia, she's also in the audience. And together we really managed to go from squishy liquid droplets to eventually particles that were completely polymerized. But in addition to that, it turned out that the polymerization process was really interesting. This is the moment before Jon and Lydia turn on the UV lights. We're looking from the side, and you see the asymmetry of the droplets, right? So for those of you who are polymer chemists, you might know that when you polymerize an acrylate, they shrink, the material shrinks. But now we have a peel, right? We have an orange peel. And imagine you have an orange peel, but you're shrinking the peel, but not the orange. What's going to happen? You're going to have frustration, right? And that's exactly what happens. You're shrinking this shell around an incompressible liquid, that is water, so they all bulge out near the thinnest point. And if you now wash these in acetone, then the swelling pressure that takes place, it's just going to pop that bulged out portion into a hole. And you end up with shells. These look as if they're not spherical, but that's because they are, it's an optical distortion. What you get is perfectly round spheres, each one with exactly one hole. And they still have their optical properties intact. And that hole is actually very important for the way we can make these invisible, by the way. But it doesn't end there. We have fantastic PhD students, right? So a more recent example is Shu. She was supposed to just work with a new mixture and expecting the normal behavior and so on. And then she came to me and said, Jan, it doesn't work. The new mixture doesn't work. Turns out that it worked just beautifully, but she discovered that when you are bringing down the transition temperature to the range of where you're polymerizing, weird things happen. And in this case, it was simply that the boundary conditions changed on the outside, but not on the inside. And that conflict of boundary conditions gave rise to this fantastic pattern of what is called focal conics. And again, that gives even more complicated optics. So you can now imagine that if we then throw around a few of these different CSRs, as we call them, cholesteric spherical reflectors, in different ways, we get a unique pattern every time. And that was the origin of our company Trace Crystal that we founded about a year ago together with Gabriele. And Monica, one of the other co-founders, so Akam is my former postdoc, Monica is Gabriele's former postdoc. She sent this today. So this is fresh from today. You see, counterfeiting is an important issue, and we think we have a good way of solving it. But what about those markers that I told you before? Well, we started working on these as well, together with Holger Floss, thanks to an Institut Grand Ducal grant. And here's an example of such a marker. At the top, you see this is here in Limpertsberg. Maybe I start at the bottom. This is a regular mobile phone picture. We're illuminating with ordinary light. And above it is a picture taken with a camera where we have removed the infrared and UV blocking filters that are normally in front of cameras or detectors. Can you see the marker? You can probably see it. If you know where it is, you can see it. So this marker is designed for infrared operation. We turn on the infrared light, and the phone camera doesn't really see any difference. You can maybe see a little purple spot on the wood there next to it because the infrared light sends out a little bit of red light as well. But the camera that detects infrared light now suddenly sees a marker very, very clearly. So we can make markers that are invisible to the human eye, and even better if we design them for near UV operation. But a machine like a robot or an AR device can very easily see these markers. Here's an example showing the marker on a brochure, just to see that it's really difficult to detect by the naked eye. And then in this project, together with Holger and his team, his student Ali Turani developed a software that does this subtraction that I mentioned before in real time. And Hakam made a fancy device based on a beam splitter and two cameras that takes a scene and simultaneously gets a right-handed and a left-handed version of the scene. So here is the exact same scene, seen through the right-handed channel, and you see there is a red area there, and the left-handed channel, and everything is the same except the red area is black. And then this is the scene, is the stream where the left is subtracted from the right. And this works also as things are moving. So the background is always gone because the background is not circularly polarized. And wherever this thing moves, you can see always only this thing. So we can of course do markers also. Because the camera, it turned out to be much more difficult to get UV and IR circular polarizers than we thought. So we started making them indivisible. So these are of course not invisible to us, but it's just to demonstrate that this background subtraction really works, even on windows and mirrors, because that's really difficult for robots to figure out that this is a window. So these are challenging areas. But since we had to work with visible cameras, we had the idea together with Dennis, another PhD student, that, well, maybe we could just camouflage the markers instead. So here she has made a marker using green CSR on a green background, and you can probably see it because I have scaled it up a lot, but it's actually pretty difficult to discover. But if you look at it through a left polarizer, then you see it quite strongly, because now you see the full reflection from the CSRs, but 50% of the light from the background is gone because we put in a polarizer. If you switch to the right, then the color from the CSRs is gone, and if you now do the left minus right, then you have very high contrast image. So this is very close up, but just to show that it also can work at a longer distance. Dennis and I had a fun session outside here where we were photographing through her gadget to test this concept. And here you see me holding her sample, also with two beetles, by the way. We wanted to check if her stuff is as good as nature's stuff, and it turns out it is. And this is through a left polarizer, and you can see the green area of the marker. This is from when she switched to the right polarizer, and you see it's gone. And if you subtract, you see the professor's subtraction is perfect. So only the marker and the beetles, of course, remains. What do we want to do with this? Well, the vision is something like this. Imagine you have a regular traffic scene in Luxembourg, for instance, and you have autonomous vehicles trying to manage their way there. If every item of importance, cars, ambulances, trams, and so on, have markers that tell that I'm an ambulance, I'm a fire engine, I'm a police car, I'm a tram, and so on, I'm a bicyclist. And the robots can see exactly where are they, how are they moving, and so on. This would be very, very helpful. In particular, since you can remove the background. So there are no false positives. The robots or AR devices will be able to really read the scene with incredible clarity. And for us, nothing changes because it's in the invisible range. These are some examples I see Phil is in the audience, it's very nice. So another example is using these types of materials for making solar cells colorful without reducing the performance of the solar cell. So you can do so many things with these materials, but again, it all started with curiosity. That's what I've been trying to show here, that all these phenomena we were running into, they were always just triggering our curiosity. But then by discussing with a lot of people, we saw a lot of opportunities for applying this. Let me show you a few examples also of what we can do with the liquid crystal elastomers. And Holger is involved in that one as well. So these elastomers, you can make them incredibly easy. It was Regis who developed this chemistry that has now become standard in the international community. You just pour the precursor into a dish, you let the solvent evaporate, you let the liquid crystal phase form by self-assembly, and you get this incredible strong color. And this mechanochromic response, how the color changes in response to deformation, it's very straightforward to explain. Imagine you have the red color initially, and now you deform this. Rubbers are liquids that cannot flow, they are incompressible. So if you deform them, they have to do so under constant volume, which means that if you make the area larger, the thickness has to get shorter. So the pitch has to be compressed. And therefore you go from red to blue. Another important thing is that you don't have to pour into a mold. You can actually paint the precursor directly onto the surface where you want these. And this then enabled collaboration with Danielle Baldwin-Diedrich and her student Tarek Kamo, where we painted these onto concrete bricks. And the idea was to see if we can detect cracks. And you'll see here, I think it's Regis holding the brick and Tarek is hammering on the right side, that it works pretty well. Already there you start seeing it, there you see it more, and eventually they will hammer it until it cracks, and then you see it really goes blue. So by seeing this color change, you can detect cracks at a much, much earlier stage than when you would see the crack otherwise. And this is really of interest for a field called structural health monitoring, which is booming, but most people are working with very expensive electronic and optical components. But it's an important field, because what you want to do is to avoid these types of events, like the Morandi Bridge disaster, or many smaller events that we maybe don't always hear about, but they happen often. And I want to show this really quite impressive example to really demonstrate the power. This is a reinforced concrete slab, so it's really what you make buildings of. And this is in Danielle's lab, where they are pressing from above until this slab breaks. And we've painted, or Regis has painted the slab with the polystyrene liquid crystal elastomer. It is green initially. And I'm going to play the movie just before the first crack appears. And I turn on the sound in the beginning, because you hear the crack forming with a snap. And look at the movie when you hear the snap. You're going to see the crack exactly at the same time. There you go. There it is, and the longer you play the movie, you see the crack growing and so on. But the important thing is that you saw it very, very immediately when it formed. So here's the same example on the same type of slab without the polystyrene. Same experiment, I'm going to play the movie. You hear the crack, but you see nothing. There's no way that you would have detected this crack without the coating. So this is really powerful, and now I'm exploring this together with Numa Bertela here at the engineering department, and we're seeing whether we can make these coatings also last outside. We're going to put these on wheel bridges outdoors. We can also make fibers of these CLCs, and there we go. And there you can actually look at how does the tension in the fiber change as you tighten a knot and as you release it afterwards. And we published a paper where we compare different knots, and you could really see as you tighten it and we release, you can see how depending on the type of knot, you get different strength, different tension. And this paper caught the attention of Attila Dubesch. He is a surgeon in Germany. He's specializing in robotic surgery, and he contacted me and said, look, can we do some work together? And he told me that robotic surgery is really a very hot topic. It's happening. I mean, he's using it every day. But there is one huge problem. Because, so if you don't know how robotic surgery works, you have a robot that is doing the actual surgery. The surgeon is standing somewhere else and manipulating everything with controls and looking at the screen what's happening. But the tactile feedback is gone. So what he told me is that we keep on over-tightening the suture thread and it breaks. And we end up spending half an hour looking for the needle in the patient. And he really needed a color-changing suture thread so that he can judge how tight is the suture thread. So how tight is the tension? So when he saw this, he was really excited, and we are now applying for a project. We're together also with a major company in the UK that are making suture threads, where we're going to try to adjust this to the requirements of suture threads, because of course there are very specific requirements. So again, a bunch of important collaborations, and I also want to just mention Pranjal here. So Pranjal is not really a direct collaborator, he's the head of the incubator, but he has been so important throughout the whole journey of looking for applications. And he couldn't come tonight, but he said, look, you should mention this paper. And this is a paper that is quite interesting, which focuses on the reverse effect, that doing applied research is also a very good way of fostering fundamental discoveries. And that's actually true. That discovery that she made, it was really made because we were trying to do something for a very applied purpose, but we ended up completely reanalyzing or with a completely new understanding of how polymers interact with liquid crystals. So I want to, in principle, I wanted to quickly end with a little bit on the reverse case where you maybe sometimes you really need to go take a top-down perspective and tell researchers what they should do, right? Because there are important cases. And of course, the most important case is the Manhattan Project. And that worked, right? Was it efficient? I don't know. Is building an atom bomb working? Well, it is, right? It was maybe inevitable that it worked, that it would happen. But when you do top-down directed research, it doesn't always work the way you expect it to, because you are creating incentives that are very different from this curiosity that is driving our research. How many of you recognize this lady?
The blood.
Sorry?
Is it the blood? She's overcome something, right?
Very much so, yeah. So this is Theranos. Theranos was the company. This is Elizabeth Holmes. They claimed they had devised blood tests that could be performed rapidly and accurately, requiring just small amounts of blood using compact automated devices they had developed. It was founded in 2003 by Elizabeth Holmes when she was 19 years old. They raised $700 million US. The value peaked in 2013 at $9 billion, and it was all fake, unfortunately. So I want to kind of say that yes, stimulating innovation is important, but it's also important to be aware of the risks. And maybe one of the best advice we can listen to also from the business world is Steve Jobs saying it doesn't make sense to hire smart people and tell them what to do. We hire smart people so they can tell us what to do. And this should work also for academic research, I think, including frontier research. And that is also the principle guiding behind or the principle guiding the European Research Council, ERC, when it was funded. ERC has always been, and still is, completely independent. No politicians or European Commission members can tell them how they should use their money, because ERC challenges the smartest people in the world to tell them what ERC should be doing research on, and then allows those that make the best case to prove them right. Very much like Steve Jobs' mindset, but applied to fundamental science. I want to end on this note because since a bit more than a month, there is now a program that is called the Ambassadors for the ERC, and I'm quite proud to be the first ambassador for Luxembourg. It's an activity that is organized jointly by the ERC and what is called the Association of ERC Grantees, of which I'm also a member. And we recently issued a statement about a rather worrisome formulation in the plans for the upcoming ERC funding scheme. Namely, current discussions of the successor framework program to Horizon Europe suggest it will be tightly connected to a European competitiveness fund. This greatly endangers the ERC's unique position as a pan-European funder, one that is independent of any national and European political agenda and dedicated solely to scientific excellence. So I would like to end with saying that a wise policy for financing impactful science is that you support curious and capable scientists to explore whatever problem they are passionate about, as long as they make a convincing case that the problem is scientifically interesting. Then you encourage them to share their results, as well as their passion, as early as possible in a broadly accessible language, not just for their peers, and on platforms accessed by others than their peers. Institutions like IAS are great for this. And organize meetings, meetings and other conversation opportunities for researchers from different disciplines, where you also bring in artists, entrepreneurs, investors, and so on. And then you support startups that can take the promising ideas from the research into actual products. In the end, you have to tell the full story, how the curiosity-driven research made the product possible. Okay, I'm sorry that I ended up a little bit longer than I intended, but let me simply end by acknowledging the funding, of course, and the people who made this research possible. This is the group. Alejandro and Tadej were on vacation, so they are added as a service there. And thank you very much for your attention, and if you have any questions or comments, I would be more than happy to discuss.
Okay, thank you very much, Jan, for this stimulating talk. And if there are questions, I'm not moderating the discussion, just ask directly.
Sorry, recovering from a cold. So. Yes.
So you experience the research environment Korea, Europe. Often it is said that in Southeast Asia, US, they are better in bringing research results to the market. Called the Valley of Steps in Europe. Considering your experience, what do you think is this obstacle in Europe to bring research results to the market? Is there mindset of the researchers, the structure?
That's a complex question. I'm not entirely sure that Koreans necessarily are better. Maybe they do it more. Same thing with the US. I think the biggest difference between Europe and the US is definitely that in Europe you're more afraid of failing. So you don't invest until you feel very confident that this is going to work. Whereas in the US, it's no part of the deal to fail, and they let many companies fail. Then Europe is different between these different countries. Last week, I was at a conference in Stockholm at KTH, and they had a session on innovation, where KTH Innovation was showcasing a little bit what they were doing. And I was actually extremely impressed, to be honest, because first of all, I didn't even know there was apparently a KTH Innovation Index that is used across the world to compare how innovative a university is. But then this conference was about wood science. And in that session, 5 companies, 5 startups came up and gave fantastic pitches, and they were all doing products based on lignin and cellulose. That was just 5 companies on that niche area. So all the companies at KTH, there must be hundreds, and I think that there were. You mentioned a number that I don't remember exactly. In Luxembourg, unfortunately, it's very difficult to start a company. They're simply, one of the big differences is that KTH has what is called KTH Holding. Same thing with my alma mater, Chalmers. It has Chalmers Holding. So it's not that the university pays for starting a company, but the university is linked to a holding company that very often steps in and gives the very first seed money in order to get companies going. And this makes a huge difference. If you get a runway for 3 years or 2 years to hire 2-3 people, and then you can really get going. And here, the university helps with patenting and so on, but then it's kind of up to you. Find the money, launch the company, but don't launch the company too early. That was how can I tell you all about it, but we were for years just hearing it's too early, it's too early, it's too early. And finally, because we actually got money from Fit for Start, that's what kicked off the company. But it's still struggling because there's very little money for getting going. And I think this having seed funding connected to universities is very important. Same thing in Leeds in the UK. A colleague of mine, she started a company about liquid crystal elastomers. Her basic discovery was years after our basic discovery, but their company is far ahead of ours. And when I asked her about it, she said, well, it was really that the holding company of the university stepped in, put up money, helped find a CEO who was experienced from the business world, and it just moved on. And here it's more like a professor is supposed to do everything together with the postdocs and the students, and of course we have our usual duties. And honestly, I don't think professors are the right people to run companies. So in my opinion, what is really needed is that there is an intermediate stage or an intermediate actor that is not the university but linked to the university, that looks for opportunity when there is an interesting discovery made at university, or LIST for that matter, that there is funding to get the company going and to make a demonstrator or something, because that's where that's the first hurdle to get over. Very long answer, sorry about that. Yes.
Bit of a political question. So you said the Manhattan Project was essential, near essential.
Sorry,
the Manhattan
yeah.
Project was somehow near essential, or it was top down.
Yeah.
Would you say our global warming is a bigger problem, or should academia launch its brain power in a concerted effort to solve it? Or you just say only people who really love the problems that they have can solve this problem?
No, I think you need to do both. I was running out of time on the previous part, so I picked up a little bit what I wanted to say there. There are grand challenges, right? And climate change is definitely one of them. We now have quantum and AI that are definitely worth investing in. But the problem with all these situations where there is this grand challenge and there's a trend, right? Is that suddenly there is an opportunity, there's lots of money and so on, and you get people to run to this field whether they are interested in it or not. And that's the problem. That you support research in an important field, and you will get fantastic people who do fantastic research, but you also get a lot of people who just tag along. And they get money, but they actually don't produce anything useful. And they're maybe not even very happy because they would rather do something else. So that's why I think you have to have both. When there are grand challenges, and there are, you should have directed funding, but you at the same time have to have open funding that is not linked to any challenge or any grand challenge of any kind, but where people just can make the case that the research I am passionate about is really important, and allow them to do that. And the two can live in harmony. You don't have to do one or the other.
Coming back to the title of your talk, are liquid crystals smart?
I actually am not a big fan of the term smart materials. It's become very fashionable in the materials research world. That's probably why I used it. And there are different people who have tried to define what is a smart material, right? They're definitely responsive, so they change their behavior in response to stimuli, and they can fill functions. So in that sense, maybe you can argue that they are smart in some sense. But many people would consider smart also intelligent, and no, they are not intelligent materials. They are not thinking materials. Yes, I can. Oh,
I'm
sorry.
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just go ahead.
So, one question, you started your talk by saying that everyone asks you, what is it used for?
Mm-hmm.
Is your deviation from fundamental kind of curiosity-driven research into applied, and we see a lot of it, was it really something that you decided, or is it just to answer the question?
No, it wasn't a transition. I have always been interested in applied research. Initially, when I had a very small group, there was maybe not really the opportunity to do both, right? It was more focused on one or the other, but I was always interested in applied research as well. What made me annoyed was that there was basically zero appreciation of the value of the fundamental research. It was like, well, why are you doing this? That was the attitude, right? And that was what I reacted to. So, but it's not that I wasn't that I have transitioned from fundamental to applied. We are still doing very fundamental research. When I'm in the shoes paper, for instance, right? It's very recent, and it was really. I think we came up with a very interesting new hypothesis for how polymers, water-dissolved polymers, interact over the interface to a liquid crystal in a very interesting way in terms of entropy and order interactions and so on. So this is absolutely fundamental research that was stimulated by the applied context. So we're still doing both, and I would like to do both. But a little bit related to the question about the company formation, right? What I'd like is to do the applied research up to a point. But then I want you and other people to take over when it comes to really bringing it to market. That's something I find a little bit frustrating with the University of Luxembourg attitude, that they somehow assume that the professor is going to be very much involved even long into the company formation. I think it would be much better that you're going to be on the advisory board, leave it, let the young people take over, and let it lead its own life. Elizabeth.
Yes, thanks, Jan. Coming back a bit to the question about funding and applied and so on. So
So what we have seen, at least in life sciences, is over the last years, even though I like the idea of it has been to be driven by curiosity, we all know that funding is very much concerned by applications, by also more translational and so on. And so what do you think then about the funding schemes that we have in Luxembourg abroad? You talked about the ERC. I also still see a lot of applications in ERC. I would say that we have completely shifted away from really fundamental questions and grants that are, because also of time, we are pressed all the time, this is the new society, so we don't have like 50 years ago the time to look at GFP for a long time. So what is your suggestions about how research could come back to this more curiosity-driven research? Which funding schemes would we need to have in place?
No, that's true. Also, the ERC is not necessarily just curiosity-driven, but it's at least the important thing is that the ERC is at least so far completely independent. So there is at least an opportunity for curiosity-driven research to find a home there. I've also seen this, and I talked to other colleagues who review ERC proposals, that the most exciting proposal that was really coming with original ideas was never funded, because they were kind of against the trends and not doing what everyone else was doing, and in the end the funded projects ended up being actually pretty mainstream, which is sad, definitely. And I guess what I've been trying to do tonight to basically create an awareness of how important fundamental research can be in the long run. I think that's what we need to do, and to share these stories, because a lot of people don't know them. They often see the applied result and think that this was just a continuous stream, one directed stream, and this is the end of the research source. And it's really not the case at all. But first of all, we just have to make sure that there is at all funding that is not politically steered, and that's where ERC needs protection at the moment, unfortunately. In Luxembourg, I mean, we still have the FNR open, right? So, but I mean, of course, there is always a conversation about how much there should be directions of the research funding. But the more we can share the stories of how fundamental research actually can lead to very, very important discoveries, the better, I think. And maybe also the interdisciplinary connections help to move things in the right direction as well.
Well, I think with that we should conclude, because we can continue this discussion about funding schemes outside. The paper is waiting for us. So thank you so much, Jan, for this.